If you read or listen to a recitation of Chapter 3 of the Platform Sutra of the Sixth Patriarch, it seems as if Huineng, in referring to what were prevalent beliefs back at that time in Amita's Pure Land, that he's saying that the Pure Land, the experience of the Pure Land, can be had in the here and now. Well, we know that the here and now is the ultimate reality in a sense. So, there's certainly some validity to that. But, there's also validity, I think, to the Shinran interpretation of Pure Land, which is that it is a place in the western part of the universe that we can be reborn in when we die as a function of the power of Dharmakara's vow when he was a bodhisattva and later became Amida Buddha. What is my basis for saying this? Well, in that chapter, Huineng says, "The world-honored one taught about the Western paradise in order to entice the sentient beings to practice Buddhism." So he's, in a sense, making reference here to the fact that, as is articulated in great detail in the Lotus Sutra, that the Buddha uses expedient means. He uses methods and approaches that have the potential to draw people of various personalities and orientations to follow the path that will ultimately lead them to Buddhahood. And certainly one aspect of the Shin Buddhist belief is that when we die, we immediately become Buddhas. He goes on to say, Huineng does, "The explanation of it as distant, as opposed to immediate and here and now, is done on behalf of those with inferior capacities." And then a couple of sentences later he says, "The deluded person recites the Buddha's name and seeks for birth in that other location," in contrast with the person who is enlightened, presumably, who can experience the Pure Land as a form of non-duality or non-dual consciousness, again, in the here and now. This idea that the Pure Land approach is designed for people of inferior capacities or who are deluded is certainly consistent with what Shinran says in the Tannisho, which contains within it many of Shinran's statements based on reporting from his disciple Yenbo. And I refer here to his second paragraph where he says, Shinran does, "I simply accept and entrust myself to what a good teacher told me," referring to Honen. Quote, "Just say the name and be saved by Amida. Nothing else is involved." And let me just go on here, and I do have a recitation, I think, on one of my playlists of the Tannisho in complete form, but here in this second chapter he says, "I have no idea whether the Nembutsu, which is saying Namo Amida Butsu, is truly the seed for my being born in the Pure Land, or whether it is the karmic act for which I must fall into hell. Should I have been deceived by Honen Shonen and, saying the name, plunge utterly into hell, even then I would have no regrets. The person who could have attained Buddhahood by endeavoring in other practices, such as are recommended by Huineng for persons of superior capacity, that then I might regret that I'd been deceived if I said the Nembutsu and so fell into hell. But I am one for whom any practice is difficult to accomplish. So hell is to be my home whatever I do." In other words, he's acknowledging his limitations, his spiritual limitations. So he says, in terms of his own logic in this regard, that if Amida's primal vow, which gives us this promise of rebirth and that land far away, as opposed to the land that's close, that basically Huineng is recommending to us, that if Amida's primal vow is true and real, Sakyamuni's teaching cannot be lies. Why? Because in the Sukhavati Sutras, Sakyamuni is basically describing Dharmakara's vows and his career that led to his becoming of Amida Buddha. Now, You, of course, can talk about the fact that in the Sugavadi Sutras, which are Mahayana sutras written, in the early part of the Common Era, that, this actually was not the historical Sakyamuni Buddha, but these sutras, these scriptures, were inspired by these Mahayanists who were in touch with the kind of deep insights that Huineng is able to articulate on behalf of persons in this day, even though he lived, back in the 7th century, who wish to pursue a more difficult, challenging path. And that's cool, that's great. But for those of us with greater limitations, for those of us who, as Huineng would say, have many clouds that cover the fullness of the sun of wisdom, well, these Mahayana sutras that talk about the Pure Land are very valuable to us and meaningful to us. So Sakyamuni, he says again, if Amita's primal vow is true and real, Sakyamuni's teaching cannot be lies. If the Buddha's teaching is true and real, then Shantao's commentaries cannot be lies. Shantao being one of the 7 patriarchs within the Shin Buddhist tradition. If Shantao's commentaries are true and real, can what Honen said be a lie? In other words, Honen is his direct teacher, Shinran's. And if what Honen said is true and real, then surely my words cannot be empty. Such, in essence, is the Shinjin, or faith, or true and trusting of the foolish person that I am. Shinran went so far as to rename himself, I think it was Gataku, or foolish, bald-headed one, something along that line. Such, in essence, is the Shinjin of the foolish person that I am. Beyond this, whether you entrust yourself taking up the Nembutsu, or whether you abandon it, is your own individual decision. I've said and indicated in different ways that Shinran is my role model. Shinran is the person that I can most relate to in terms of his experience of realizing his limitations with respect to his ability to attain enlightenment or Buddhahood in this life. Understanding that, again, Huineng's point that we're all Buddhas now if we could only get in touch with our true nature, but some of us have a harder time doing that than others. So just quickly going back to Huineng in that 3rd chapter of the Platform Sutra, he in this sutra is constantly having people coming to him and asking him questions. In fact, his elaboration of his view on the Pure Land was based on a query by one of his followers. Well, he asks a question in many senses rhetorical, or in some sense rhetorical, but I'm going to answer his question in the context of my Shin Buddhist beliefs when he says, if you recite the Buddha's name and seek rebirth in the Pure Land without being enlightened, how will you ever be able to travel such a long road? And of course, the Shin Buddhist response is, we travel that road through Amita's grace via the power of his primal vow. And then I'll close with indicating that in spite of what Huineng is admirably trying to do, which is to help people along the road representing the path of sages to an experience of enlightenment in this life, in the here and now, that he also expresses reverence in some sense for what I think of as the cosmic bodhisattvas when he says, compassion is Avalokitesvara. Joy and equanimity are Mahastama Prapta, who's the other cosmic bodhisattva who flanks Amita in all the paintings, along with Avalokitesvara or Kuan Yin. And then he goes on, he says, the ability to purify is Sakyamuni, and universal directness is Amitabha. And although he's not probably meaning it with his term there, I take his phrase characterizing Amida as embodying directness, in the sense that he provides us with the direct path to salvation, the direct path to Buddhahood, that simply involves entrusting ourselves to the vow and living a life as best we can, filled with gratitude and love toward the people around us. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu.